Hi Anna, my name's Ross Cooper. This is my submission for Assignment 1A for EDFD 653, Social and Cultural Contexts of Education. This presentation will actually be split into 3 presentations due to the time limitation of Screencast-O-Matic, which I'm using to record the presentation. By way of introduction, reading the prescribed text, Connell et al. In Australia, we live under the discourse of a meritocratic society. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that social advancement is determined by ability, talent, and hard work rather than inherited privilege, wealth, or networks. We live under the guise of a level playing field and a fair go for all. It's the Australian way. Now, that may be true if you're in the majority, but what if you're in the minority? And what do we define as a minority? Well, it could be low social class, you could be poor. You could be in a cultural minority, e.g. Muslim. You could be in a racial minority, e.g. South African. You could have English as a second language. You could be a refugee, a recent migrant, an asylum seeker in detention. You could be LGBTI. You could have same-sex parents. You could be an effeminate male. How will all these factors influence your educational outcome? And by educational outcome, I don't just mean scholastic results. I mean the overall educational experience of the student, which includes their well-being, whether they're subjected to bullying, are they happy, and what was their overall satisfaction with the school experience. This presentation provides an overview of 3 chapters from the prescribed text, Connell et al. Social class and inequality, cultural difference and identity, and gender. And the overview is in relation to educational outcomes. So for each of these 3 topics, I present my mind map, which summarises the key issues of each of those 3 topics. And then for each of those, I select a single key issue and then expand on that. From a personal perspective of how that's influenced my life, I then relate that to professional behaviour as a teacher. And then I look at what educational policy could be done to improve the situation. So the educational policy could either be in relation to the greater topic, such as cultural diversity and identity, or as more prescribed down to one of the single key issues. The first topic, social class and inequality. Here's my mind map, which, by the way, was produced using Bubble Us, which I found really easy to use. So this mind map is a summary of Chapter 5 in Connell et al. Generally speaking, the higher the socio-economic status and the better the parent's education, the better the education outcome will be for the children. So the minority here is you're a low social class, or you're poor, or your parents have a low education. So just looking at these, in the blue there in the middle, we have the education outcome for the student. And what goes into that? Well, there's meritocratic society, which we've talked about before, that hard work will be rewarded with success. Life chances, which are the opportunities that you have as an individual to achieve economic prosperity. Educational codes, which are social practices and knowledge that are valued in schools, such as language use, social and cultural dispositions, and ways of interacting. All these directly influence educational outcomes. Now, social stratification is the division of people into groups based on their social position. Social mobility is the movement of individuals and groups between these different class divisions. Cultural capital is knowledge, skill, disposition, and social taste that can provide access to social power. Economic capital is clearly wealth. Social capital are resources available to an individual through social membership, networks, and relationships, which can provide access to social power. Now, these 3 capitals all influence an individual's social class, which proportionally influences their educational outcomes. Now, in turn, educational outcome can provide upward social mobility, and I'll expand on that in the next couple of slides. Now, upward social mobility. From a personal perspective here, my parents' family, I consider them to be of lower middle class. Both my parents were employed in non-professional jobs. Us children, 4 of us, all attended public schools. And the 2 siblings before me were early leavers from high school. Now my family, which consisted of my wife and my 3 children, I was the first sibling to attend university. And that was the same for my wife, and she came from a similar family background, which we would consider to be lower middle class. We're now both professionally employed people. Our children attend an independent private school. Our children are all planning on attending university. And I believe we're a culturally and more socially active family than my parents' family were. And I think education has directly resulted in an intragenerational change in upward social mobility for myself and my wife. Now, looking at Cornell, that's termed meritocratic ladders of educational opportunity. It's a term that was used a long time ago, but I believe that my successful career has been a result of basically my hard work rather than any inherited privilege, wealth or networks that I had access to. I can also see there's been some intragenerational change across my siblings. My older 2 siblings, as I said, were early leavers from high school in the late 70s and early 1980s. My sister left school at year 10 for a bank job. She's now finding career limitations without a university degree. My brother left in year 10 for an apprenticeship and has been successfully and happily employed ever since. Myself and my younger sibling both completed year 12 in the mid-1980s and attended university. We're both now professionally employed. Now this inflection point here ties in perfectly when we look at period 1 and period 2 of the patterns of school completion as described in chapter 3 of Cornell. So from a professional perspective, how can I take these life learnings that I've had and put them into my context as a professional teacher to help students? I've selected 2 examples here, and one is from my professional experience program PEP placement at Redcliffe State High School earlier this year. Now I taught year 7s, year 9s and year 10s. So year 7s, it was a general science class, and I shared some of my career highlights to excite them about science and encourage them to get a good education. My year 9 science class, there were some unmotivated students. So I gently suggested to them that without a good education, their life chances would be reduced. And I used some of the examples of my career and life chances that I'd had and related that back to education. My year 10 core mathematics class. Now this is a small class with very low ability. Some of them had sort of year 5 level maths ability, low socioeconomic status, very low engagement with school, low motivation. Again, I shared my educational experiences with them in the hope that it would encourage them to do better in mathematics and just in school in general, because it was such a vital part of their development. And looking at my own children as students, and they are of that right age. They're age 14, 12 and 10, so they're in grades 9, 7 and 5. I push them to work hard, aim for the stars and succeed. I help them with their homework, I encourage them and support them. I tell them that if they want to continue living their current lifestyle, then they need to get a great education as a starting point. Now, social class and inequality from an education policy perspective. What can be done to reduce inequality? So there was some research done a while ago in Queensland that is done by Hayes and cited in Cornell, and it's termed productive pedagogies. And it really came out of the finding that teachers' pedagogical and assessment practice do matter, and that they particularly matter for those students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So this notion of productive pedagogies was born, and it's based on intellectual quality, correctness of knowledge, and supportive teaching environments. And most importantly, it's about directly working with and valuing social difference, not ignoring it. And some other research or some other literature that I've read clearly shows there's a persistent and proportional relationship between socioeconomic status and the education outcomes for students in Australia. And it's a very complex problem. The recent agreement to implement the Gonski review of funding for schools will assist, and the aim of that is directing funding towards areas of greatest need to address inequality. That will certainly assist. However, funding alone cannot rectify the problem, and differences in educational outcomes are linked to differences in participation and engagement at all levels of schooling. Disadvantaged young people, most in need, must be connected with the education providers who are best able to support them. And this comes from Lamb, Jackson, Wastab and Hua from 2015. The second section we looked at in this assignment is cultural diversity and identity. In Cornell, this is chapter 6. Generally speaking, if you are in a cultural minority, your educational outcomes will be below average, or you'll need to put in extra effort and be resilient to overcome inequality. So key issues that relate to educational outcomes from a cultural perspective. Essentially, there was no multicultural education prior to the end of the White Australia policy. At that time, Australia was one of the whitest countries on earth. Following that, there's been gradual incorporation of migrant cultural teaching into the Australian curriculum, but it lags behind migration trends. There are some issues with that. However, even though there is some cultural teaching in the Australian curriculum, outdated texts are an issue. There's a lack of culturally specific language teachers, and cultural texts often do not reflect Australian content because they're not Australian written books. There's also a gradual opening of independent schools for other cultures, e.g. Muslim cultures, but again it lags behind migration trends. And it suffers from some of the same issues, that outdated texts are an issue, and there's a lack of culturally specific language teachers available. Some migrant cultural sectors, oh hang on, I'm getting funny page breaking here. Some migrant cultural sectors have above average outcomes. For example, would be higher socioeconomic status Asian children. Some migrant cultural sectors have below average outcomes, and an example of this would be lower socioeconomic status Muslim children, particularly males. Another issue is English is becoming the global language. Well, we believe it is. Many Australians are therefore unwilling to learn a second language, and some migrant children are not learning their parents' language, so there's going to be a loss of cultural history there. In Australia, there's a very high quality of education available from an international perspective, and for international students, tertiary education can lead to employment in Australia, which can lead to permanent residency, which can lead to Australian citizenship, which is a very big drawcard. Racist views of society carry over into education, and all the while racism is diminishing, it is still present. And something that did alarm me to read in text was children in refugee camps are generally denied access to education. This mind map, by the way, was made using wise mapping, which I didn't find particularly easy to use. We will have to leave this here and get on to another presentation because we've run out of time.